Hello and welcome to another episode of Let's Argue About Plants, the podcast for people who love plants.
But not always the same ones. I'm Carol Collins. I'm associate editor at Fine Gardening Magazine.
Hey guys, happy summer. I'm Danielle. I am the executive editor at Fine Gardening. You all know that by now. I mean, come on, binge listeners. I know I binge my favorite podcast. So hopefully you're binging us on your summer vacation. And today we're going to talk to you about plants. Oh, this is kind of depressing because now we're going to talk about winter a little bit, but these are tender plants worth saving. And I'm looking outside right now, Carol, and for me, that category, that of topic means tropical plants, many tropical plants. I don't have as many as I used to because, why? I am a lazy gardener and I don't like overwintering things and having to bring things inside. But sometimes there are plants that are truly worth the extra effort. Is that your feeling as well?
Yes, and I also, especially in the past, was less likely to save things. I just say, go and be with your creator and let them go into the compost pile.
But you've changed your tune on certain things.
There are more and more, as it goes. I have started saving more plants through the winter, mainly because I've learned how to do it. So
there you go. Yeah. And I think, there used to be this thing where, in order to save a tender plant, maybe it's when you're just getting into gardening or such, and you think, oh, okay, so I'm going to need full southern exposure inside, and I'm going to battle pests and diseases all winter long because these are going to get plagued with it, and I'm going to have to water on a regular schedule, and these are very needy plants. And a lot of the cases of the ones that I'm going to talk about, I throw it in a garbage bag in the basement. So it's actually, I think I've started to gravitate towards the tender plants that are worth saving for me, or the ones that are the easiest to save over the winter. But again, I think that goes into the lazy gardener thing, but I don't know. Maybe that's just me. But what is a plant that you think is worth saving from year to year, and you're willing to go that extra step?
So I have one that I grew from seed this year, and it took a long time.
Okay. So you've already put in the extra effort, and now you're gonna honor your investment.
Yeah, because you can start this from seed every year, but it would be so great if I could just save some of these over the winter and not have to start over again from scratch. And so the plant I'm thinking about is Oxford Blue Gentian Sage. Oh. And that's a Salvia Patins cultivar, and it is only hardy from zones 8 to 10. It likes full sun, it likes well-drained soil, and it is adaptable to a variety of soil types, including sand, which is good for me because I have sand. Mm-hmm. From seed, this plant had to be put in the starter tray 12 weeks before the average last frost.
Holy
12 weeks,
cow.
folks. So I started it in mid-February, and that's when I started my grow lights, and I had to keep them going until they could be outside. Wow. And I had a limited amount of seed, and germination was good and not great. So I ended up with about 15 plants. They went outdoors in sort of mid to late May after we were sure that the last frost had gone by. And what I have learned is that this Salvia Patins, has tuberous roots. Mm-hmm. And so you can actually, at the end of the season, you can dig this up and store it dormant. And so what I'm going to try is digging it up, cleaning off as much off the root ball as I can, but still maintaining a good root ball, pop it in a nursery pot, and then let it go dormant. Okay. I think you could do this one in a plastic bag, but I am not going to take a chance. Maybe if I did some in pots and some in plastic bags, I could get data on the best way to store this through the winter. Mm-hmm. But what you're looking for, in probably most of these cases, is a cool, dark, relatively dry spot. So I have a basement that stays in the 55-degree range for pretty much year round. And that's where my salvias will probably spend the winter this year. We'll see.
That's amazing. So basically you end up almost treating it like a dahlia tuber is what you're thinking. Or is it more like is it going to be more like a bare root plant that
it's not? So I really want to keep the soil that is around the root ball.
Okay. So this is planted in ground. So you're basically going to pot it up, basically.
I'm going to pot it up, dig it up, pot it up, and let it dry out. Now, some people say that you should give potted plants like that are dormant a little water over the winter. I don't know. I mean, I might, but I might forget. And so we're gonna get data on what happens if we don't water it during the winter.
Yeah. And whether it bounces back again. That's interesting. Okay, so this is going to be an interesting experiment. So this is Salvia Patins, and it was a particular cultivar, correct?
Oxford blue. And what I love about this one, I've got the photo in the show notes are the first 2 flowers on it. And they are just this astonishing shade of blue. Like, I mean, nothing that I can think of has this shade of blue. Super deep, like pure blue. Nice. And that's what makes it worth saving for me.
That is, I will say, so several years ago, and you could find it on finegardening.com, Richard Hockey from the Chicago Botanic Garden did an article for us, a feature article on non-hardy sages. And as you were saying this, I was thinking of when I went to go photograph those, there were several of those, Salvia Patins that were in the, zone 8 to zone 9 hardiness range. They were so electric blue that you saw them from across, a half acre of garden. And it was like, zeroing in on it. I'm like, oh, what's that? And you get closer and closer. And yeah, I think the only thing that comes to mind is like Himalayan blue poppy. Is that
very similar color? Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
Maybe even a little bit more intense.
So beautiful. Well, true blue is hard to find in the garden, so that makes that truly a plant that's worthy of that. Was that the first seed that you started above and beyond all other vegetable seeds? Because I know you're a big veggie gardener, but 12 weeks, holy cow.
12 weeks. That and another salvia is what I started at 12 weeks. And then the next things to go in were at 8 weeks. So a month ahead of everything else. It's a commitment.
It is. But, I think that it'll be interesting too to see that, giving that the overwintering experiment this year, that if your plants size up, get bigger, put on a more impressive flower show in their second, third, subsequent years afterwards, that totally makes it worth it. So instead of, overall only getting a plant that's maybe, 8 inches tall and wide, then you get one that, you've got a shrub by year 3.
Yes. And I think that's the big advantage, right? You're starting from a substantial root system that as soon as it hits the ground is going to start pushing up some new growth. I'm hoping.
Yeah.
I don't know. But if the roots are tuberous the way I've read, then I think this should be a no-brainer.
That's amazing. Oh, okay. All right. Report back. We're going to have to do a segment 2 of this podcast next spring and be like, okay, remember those overwintering tips we gave you guys? Let's see if they came to fruition and they actually worked. I think that
the what survived edition.
Exactly.
Plants worth saving.
Exactly. Well, so my first plant that's definitely worth overwintering, and I have overwintered for the last few years, and I've made more of, is escargot rex begonia. And that's begonia escargot. It is zones 10 to 11. So this is really a houseplant begonia, for better or worse. I have very limited shade, but it is a shade plant that I actually grow in a container. This year all by itself, just doing its thing. And it's an awesome plant. Rex begonias, I think, are pretty foolproof. They're very easy. They're forgiving if you forget to water them and they start to dry up and kind of look crinkly. You douse them with water and they, those succulent stems fill up very quickly and it bounces back again. But escargot, as you can imagine, has a swirled leaf. So it really looks like that snail shell, that escargot snaily shell. And the leaves are slightly larger than a softball size. And they're a silvery blue color. The underside is kind of a burgundy. The stems of this plant are kind of succulent-y, I guess would be the way to describe them, covered in tons of little red hairs to them as well. And just a really amazing foliage plant, really shocking, really gives you that, silver blue hue from afar. People always ask like, oh, this is really cool. What kind of Rex begonia is this? Awesome. It gets pinky blooms to it. I honestly cut them off because I'm not growing it for the blossoms. I really don't care. Sends up a little spike with these kind of wax begonia-like jangly little flowers to it. It's usually late fall by the time it does anything for me and, in this more temperate climate. But 8 to 12 inches tall and wide and just freaking gorgeous. But super easy to overwinter, and I overwinter it as a houseplant. It is probably in a 12 to 14 inch wide and deep container at this point. I bring it in. I don't have great indoor light in my house. I generally put it in a west facing window, but I've got a big tree line, so it's not getting a ton of, good light. It's getting kind of filtered indirect light if possible. I shove a cookie sheet underneath it because, of course, I put it in a container that didn't come with a saucer. So usually I have a cookie sheet underneath it. I sometimes remember to water it. The one thing I've learned over the years is to keep it away. We have forced hot air in our home. So I need to keep it away from the blower and the heat register because they really do tend to crinkle out the leaves, and the leaves dissect pretty easily if it's really too close to a heat source. But the other thing is I hedge my bets because I am not the best houseplant person, and there will be times, and there have been times, where I've forgotten to water even once a month this poor begonia. So generally what I do is I take a couple of cuttings of the leaves and I put them in little glass jars on my kitchen windowsill, and I just kind of watch them as leaf cuttings develop little root systems over the winter. And then the next year, if I killed the mother plant, or if I want a couple of little other escargot begonias to transfer into some other containers, usually they're well rooted by the time spring rolls around and the threat of frost is gone, and I pop them in those containers to kind of do their thing. So there's, you're kind of hedging your bets in two ways. Treat one just like a house plant, and treat the other. Take some leaf cuttings of it beforehand and set it up on a windowsill. And pretty easy to overwinter. Begonias in general are pretty easy to overwinter because I am not a good overwinterer. Are you a begonia person? Are you a Rex begonias ever in your cadre of plants?
I love them, but I've never had the Rex begonia. Right now, and it's kind of an accident that I have it. I've got a red supreme tuberous begonia.
Oh, okay.
Not one of the fancy pants ones. Like these are like 3 for $8 at the like garden center. But we needed a photo for the Tom Habs did summer bulbs for us in a recent issue, and we needed a photo that showed like potting up a tuber early in the spring. So now I have some little begonias, and they're fun. I love those fuzzy leaves. They're so cool.
Textural wonders for sure. So are you going to try, and now I'm sorry, I'm putting it on you. Are you going to try and overwinter the tuber from the tuberous begonia, Carol, or are you going to call it a day?
No, I think I'm going to give it a try. And I think what I can do is just cut it to the ground, get the dirt off those tubers, and then save them the same way that I do with dahlias.
Yeah. All right. So now we've got another one that we're all reporting back on to see if it works. All right, Carol. Up next I really am getting depressed talking about like plants we're going to overwinter. I mean, it's just too soon, it feels like, but I know it's not. We need to start thinking about these things, right?
Right now in midsummer is when you kind of make that call, I think, like, is it going to be worth saving this, or am I feeling kind of meh about this very high maintenance plant?
Well, what is a plant that you're not feeling meh about?
Okay, this is one that has spent the winter indoors with me for many years now. It's Variegated Peperomia.
Okay.
Some people call this baby rubber plant, which is kind of a cute common name. That's a Peperomia Obtusifolia variegata, and it is hardy only from zones 10 to 11. So it really cannot take any kind of frost. It needs to be indoors, actively growing through the winter. So this isn't one that you could do as a dormant over winter. It's got great foliage. Really, this is a plant that you grow for foliage. It looks a little like a jade plant, like a crassula, but it has a sort of a thinner succulent leaf, and the leaves are kind of cupped and they're very glossy. And this has like gorgeous marbled variegation, which is sort of a creamy color mixed with olive green and then a darker green, and in very the patterns are just like not regular, very irregular,
cool.
swirly, cool, and reddish stems. And then occasionally it will get a flower, which is like this long stick-like pointy, I think it's a spathe technically.
Okay.
Kind of like the Jack part of Jack in the Pulpit, but long.
Gotcha.
And, not particularly showy, but just cool. Like the first time I saw it, I said, what is that?
It's growing an alien. What's happening?
Yeah, seriously. But this is a cool plant. It likes, I don't really think of myself as having house plants per se. I think of myself as having plants that need to spend the winter indoors, and they don't generally love it. But when it's outside, you need to keep this one in partial shade, or at least, enough shade so that the leaves don't burn, because those pretty variegated leaves will scorch. Ask me how I know.
Oopsies.
Yeah. Oh, this was actually a rescue plant, which had lived on the admin desk at Fine Gardening when we were in the old building. And when we moved, that nobody cared about this plant. I said, okay, come home with me. You can spend the summer with me. And what did I do? I put it right in the sun, and all the leaves burned. And it was like a while before it looked good again. But it did recover, and it's gotten a little bigger every year. And I still find it worth bringing in and out every year.
So when it is outside, Carol, is it like, do you treat it like a patio plant? Like, is it with other mixed containers, or is it just kind of hanging out as like a tabletop planter on your picnic table, or where does it hang out? Because it sounds like that is the only plant in said pot, right?
It is the only one in said pot. And I do have a few mixed pots, but most of my plants that are, potted plants that come in and out are single specimens. And that makes it easy for me to keep track of, who needs to be repotted and who needs fertilizer and who needs extra water. But I do sort of a grouping out on my back deck, which is mostly shaded, although some of those catalpa branches have come down, and now I have a little more sun back there.
See our previous issue 116, or episode 116, in order to hear about Carol's catalpa tree.
Yeah. Oh, that's a whole other story. But the back deck is really quite a nice place for all of my plants, because it gets enough light, but it's not too blaring of sun back there.
Nice. That's awesome. All right. I vaguely remember that plant on the admin desk, very, very vaguely. So I'm looking forward to looking at the show notes for this episode on finegardening.com to see what that baby looks like now, several years later. Good job. Gold star. All right. So if you've listened to this podcast, which maybe you have not before. If this is your first episode, go back to episode 1 and let's start from the beginning, kids. But, I have an agave collection. I live in Connecticut. I am on a good day, a zone 6, on a bad day, a zone 5B. I have no business having agaves. There is, in the best of cases, they say that there are some agaves that might be a zone 5. Maybe I've even seen zone 4B. That is not accurate. They do not do well here. It is not we get too much winter wet. Agaves are not a plant that you can grow outside of a pot here. So I have an agave collection. In any given year, there's 20 to maybe 30. Too many, I know. I have a problem. And here's the things about agaves. They're not fun to bring in and out of the indoors. It's hilarious because when it's time, when we start to get into October and we start to get some cooler weather, my husband will suit himself up in his chaps from Chainsaw and oven mitts and, the safety glasses, the construction safety glasses. And he just rolls his eyes at me and says, I can't believe, can you grow something that isn't covered in spikes that literally causes injuries? But they're so cool. Agaves are so neat and interesting, and I've always been into them because, it looks so different as a collection in a New England garden. I just love them, and they come in every size, shape, color, blues and creams and, spots and stripes and golds. They're kind of like the Southwestern hosta, I feel like. But they're covered in spikes and various lengths of spikes and such. But there's a new one that I got this year that I added to the collection because occasionally I'll lose a few here or there. And, far be it from me to not continue the collection. So this year I got cream spike. So it's a 6x6. So it's a baby and it makes this adorable, just rounded, compact rosette. And it is a mostly white leaf with a blue-green stripe on either side of those stubby leaves and a very, very pronounced long blue-purple spike on the end of each one of those. I have it in a really tall terracotta container, and it's just kind of a little Miss Muffet right on the top of that container, and it just looks absolutely adorable. Here's the thing. Yes, they do bite. Yes, they are protected with spikes, but they are also agaves, extremely easy to overwinter. And I've already said, I don't have southern exposure. I do not have great light in my house. But agaves are tough, man. And if you can get them into at least a little bit of indirect light, they're a cactus. They're a xeric plant. They're in the cactus succulent family. They don't need a lot of water. In fact, I've gone years where if they've gotten rained on outside on my patio a couple of weeks before I move them inside, I don't water throughout the entire winter. And that's pretty awesome. And for a collection the size of mine, it would be impossible to have all these little saucers and make sure that you're watering it, but not enough that it's going to overflow onto the wood floors. So for the most part, I leave them and let them go dry all the way into late April, early May. And then I start to move them outside and make sure that their first time outside, they get a good soaking. And I am, soaking them for many, many, many minutes and making sure that they get rehydrated. The only other thing I will say about the overwintering is that, sometimes I will lose one, and there's no predicting which one will be lost. I have a feeling that it's more related to light than to moisture of which ones, kind of don't make it through. But when they do move back outside at the end of April, beginning of May, they can take a light frost, but not a heavy freeze. I cover them with shade cloth because they have spent so many months inside that then putting them into direct sun, which is really where they want to be in their final resting place. I'm not going to move them in and out obviously for spiky reasons. I do make sure I put shade cloth over them for the first couple of weeks that they're outside, and that generally prevents most of the sunburn and the sun scald from setting in on the leaves. And then they're good to go, and they're pretty much the most low maintenance plant you can have. They just hang out on the patio. We just went through 6 weeks of no rain. I haven't watered my agaves once, and they're looking great, and they're looking deadly, and my husband still hates them, but they're beautiful. Alrighty, Carol, what's up next on deck of the Overwinter Brigade at the Collins household?
So I would say agaves are to Danielle as dahlias are to Carol. So,
I like that comparison.
Like the SAT test. So I had to do a dahlia. I mean, I didn't have to, but this is definitely the number one thing that I think is worth saving, and that I do save every single year. I don't know. I think part of what I like about overwintering dahlias is that they get bigger and better every year that you plant them. Mm-hmm. And the ones that don't make it through the winter, I just consider like, okay, that one wasn't meant to be. I'll get a prettier one that'll, maybe it'll be better. So one of my favorites that I've had now for years is called Doodlebug. And aww. I know, cute name, right? And it's just a really charming dahlia. It's classified as a miniature formal decorative. So miniature in the dahlia world is anything that's 4 inches or less in the flower size. In the beginning, when I first planted this, I made the mistake of thinking that miniature meant that it would be short. It is not. It gets 3.5 feet tall, maybe not quite as wide, maybe 3 feet wide, 2.5, 3 feet wide. Definitely needs staking, but it makes a ton of these formal decorative flowers. And the formal decorative category in dahlias is even, flat, not quilled petals. And if you think like a chrysanthemum flower, it's sort of like that, just even all over the flower head, rounded, but not super round, like the pom-pom ones are more round. So it develops an open center as the flower ages, and so the pollinators like it. And the color, oh my goodness, the color! It is maybe a cross between coral and salmon, and the center is a golden yellow. And so from a distance, it sort of has like a bit like a knockout rose, like a single rose with the pinkish around the outside and then the golden center. But just like a cool flower shape, and the color of it changes as, from the time it first opens to the time it ages out. It goes through sort of a range of those corally, peachy, orangey colors. So definitely worth saving. And here's a tip. This is why I felt like I should do a dahlia. This tip I learned from Irvin Etienne in his article, Bring It In, which you can search on our website, finegardening.com. But what he does, he uses the flagging tape, like what surveyors use. Take a piece of that, write the name on it, tie it onto the base of your plant before frost hits, because dahlias all look the same the day after the frost. And you might not remember who is who. They turn.
I love that.
Yeah, they turn black, and they, the leaves and the flowers, they all just, it's like you're not going to be able to tell from looking at it once the frost hits. But with dahlias, it is good to let the frost hit it before you lift those tubers. It sort of sends a message to the plant, oh, it's winter, time to go dormant. So after that frost, you just cut down the tops, dig them up. And I think I had mentioned in a previous episode, you can store them. I like the pet bedding that is wood shavings. You can get that at the Tractor Supply store or the pet store. And that will take up some moisture, but also keep them from drying out. And you do them in sort of an open crate. And that's, they'll be good from the time you bring them in until you bring them back out in the spring. And it's really, people say, oh, that sounds like a lot of work. I would say not as much work as bringing agaves in and out.
At least less deadly.
Right? Yes.
At least less deadly. So I have a question, Carol, about Doodlebug. So what is Doodlebug's hardiness range? Because some folks can, I mean, we don't get that luxury here in New England to be able to keep them in ground, but is Doodlebug one that's, certain folks might be able to leave in ground?
Well, certain folks. So this came from Swan Island Dahlias, and they're out in Washington State. And I think they're zone 8. If zone 8 to 11, you can leave them in the ground over the winter.
Got it.
Yeah, but for most of us, we do need to bring them in, or somehow, I do know people, and we are in zone 6, but I know people that have just accidentally left them in the ground and then they came back. And it may have been that we didn't have like a terribly cold winter, or maybe there was something, a layer of leaves or something protecting those tubers from freezing. Maybe the ground never froze, but I don't think that in our climate you can ever count on that.
Yeah, there's no banking on them being able to survive the winter. Right. Yeah. And I would assume too, in places where, winter moisture is an issue, since you were saying when you're storing it in, when you lift the tubers and you're storing it, you don't want them to dry out, but you don't want them to be just laden with moisture. So in spots normally, with us where we have really wet winters, that would probably equal death to those tubers.
Yes, I feel like actually people in zone 8 may be pulling them from the ground for that reason, that they have a wet spring and it's going to rot potentially if you leave them in during that time. So,
nice.
Yeah. But
dahlias, yeah, you are the dahlia queen. In my approximation, you are the dahlia queen, Carol. I love it. That one sounds beautiful too, like a sunset color. Like it just blows up and its color changes almost as if you watch a sunset go through.
It goes with a lot of other colors, kind of like a sunset, it goes with everything.
Love it. Love it. All right. Well, so I'm going to do red Abyssinian banana. And this is one that I probably have talked about on the podcast before, but it's a Sente Murray, zones 8 to 10. I'm not an overwinterer. Like, as you can tell from my 2 choices thus far, it's like my overwintering is treating it like a houseplant and just, basically pulling it inside. But I loathe having to go through those extra steps, but generally by the end of fall, beginning of winter, I'm kind of done on gardening for a while. I'm ready to just focus on what we're doing in the magazine, and that's about it. But after the agave collection gets inside and I'm done dealing with my cranky husband, the one thing that I will make the effort to pull back in is my red Abyssinian banana. And over the years, it has increased in size and breadth, and it's a gorgeous banana plant. It's not the tallest of bananas. It is one that only gets to be about in a pot, which is how I keep it, about 5 feet tall by 2 to 3 feet wide, kind of a vase shape with these beautiful long banana-like leaves. But the thing that's so beautiful about this is that it's a red kind of burgundy cast to the leaf on the top side with a little bit of green mixed in. And then on the underside, it is almost a pure burgundy color. In fact, I loved that color so much when we bought our house 11 years ago or so. I cut a banana leaf from the red Abyssinian banana and I brought it to the hardware store so they could color match that leaf color. And that's the color of our den, is kind of this wine Merlot color. It's beautiful. So these large spade-like leaves, it says, when you look up this plant, it'll say full sun. My experience is that it tends to get a little bleached out in full sun and tends to sometimes get a little bit of sun scald on it. So I've got it more in partial shade or really, really bright indirect light. It's very happy there. It likes moist, well-drained soil. I have it now in a pot that probably stands about 2.5 to 3 feet tall, and it's about 2 feet wide. It's a kind of a cylindrical shape to the pot. And that banana reaches its full 5-foot size, 2 to 3 feet wide in a season, because as the overwinter happens, I let the first frost hit it. It browns out the leaves, kind of probably looks like your dahlias do, at which point I come in and I just chop it down to its basic stump. And that's exactly what it is like a stump. I leave maybe 3 or 4 inches exposed, and the rest of it all gets chopped off. I take away all that foliage, I compost it into the compost pile, and then I bring it in. I give it a little bit of water, make sure that the soil is a little bit moist, and then I put it into a big black contractor's garbage bag and I tie it up. And then honestly, I let it go the entire winter in our 50 to 55 degree basement. And it's protected from the frost and such. And I honestly know when it's time to take this banana out, because it will start to poke new growth out through the top where I have tied that garbage bag, and it will be very bleached out, anemic looking foliage, and I'll go, oh God, crap, I got to bring that outside. So I'll undo the garbage bag. I'll, clean up the top if there's any, like a little bit of mold or something like that, which sometimes does occur. Again, I will put it in a shady spot to begin with, because it really is going to be susceptible in that bleached out foliage, kind of looking anemic. And basically within a couple of weeks, it is back to its glorious self. It is shooting up new growth left and right. And by the end of the next season, it is again 5 foot tall, 2 to 3 feet wide. Just stunning, and a great tropical. And it doesn't get much easier than that. It's a really easy plant to overwinter. I have heard that Zebrina banana and many of the other ornamental bananas are much the same. My experience is kind of limited to the red Abyssinian banana, but it's a great performer. It should be said that I know Irvin Etienne, we talked about before. He had this great article about, bring it inside, and he grows a lot of bananas in the ground. Now, if you would put rabbit Abyssinian in the ground, you should be prepared. It can get 8 to 10 feet in a season. So that's going to require probably a different approach. Irvin had a great approach. If you want to know what that approach was, go to finegardening.com, look up that article, bring it in. If you are growing a banana in the ground, of how to easily overwinter it. And it also involved a hefty bag as well.
It did, yes.
It's a great model.
He had a tip for bananas and anything with a hollow stem. Be sure you turn it upside down and empty. It can hold quite a lot of water in that hollow stem. So I was taking pictures of him dumping out his banana stalks. Yeah, so definitely check out that article. It is packed with information, not just on these plants we're talking about, but a whole other, all kinds of things that you would never even imagine you could overwinter like this.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And I loved that it was a very cut and dry approach to overwintering plants in that article. Now, let it be said, I am not dipping my pot upside down with my banana stem. So far, so good. Not a big deal. And I probably wouldn't even need to do the hefty bag if I was willing to go down and just check that moisture and make sure. But the hefty bag kind of keeps the moisture pretty much even. And the other thing it does for me is it prevents me, sorry guys, I hate to say this, but on occasion we will get a mouse or two. I live in the woods. That's what happens when you live in New England in the woods. And I have had the mice attack my banana trunks before and really get into it. So that was another way of like how I kind of prevent the mice from getting into my poor banana trunk. All right, Carol, we're bringing it on home. What's your last overwinter tender treasure that is worth overwintering?
Okay, so I'm going to do one that I had not actually overwintered, but I feel like there's a technique I wanted to talk about, and this is a good example for that technique. Okay. So the plant is coffee cups elephant ear, and that's a Colocasia esculenta, and it is coffee cups is the cultivar name, hardy zones 8 to 11. And it's just, elephant's ears in general are just such cool plants, big dramatic foliage. This one gets 3 to 5 feet tall, 2.5 to 4 feet wide, and long, elegant stems that are dark and sort of a smoky colored leaf that's green, but with that, like maybe, dipped in coffee kind of dark color.
Mm-hmm.
So a cool looking plant. And I would say any of the colocasias, like totally worth a try. Just it's such a different texture than most of our cold hardy perennials or even woody plants. And so Irvin, in his article, which was from issue 184, he said that he has experimented with all kinds of overwintering techniques, and he has found some plants are not as fussy as you would think. And he named specifically colocasias as something that he has had 100% success rate overwintering in trash bags, like little shopping trash bags, or something like you would line the wastebasket with. Mm-hmm. So here's the technique that Irvin describes. He says that plants that are going to be stored in closed plastic bags, you can do closed plastic bags or open ones. Mm-hmm. What you do, you dig it up and you prep the roots by taking off as much of the soil and root ball as you can, but you still want to maintain a good soil and root ball. And that's sort of what's going to sustain the plant over the winter. Cut the tops right down to the soil. And then give each one, you can label it at this point using the flagging tape technique. Tie it onto the plant, drop it into the shopping bag. I skipped a step, an important step. First, you should let it dry out for a week.
Okay, so you've lifted it out of the ground, you've kicked off some of the soil, but kept some of most of the roots and soil ball intact. Then you're at which point you're letting it dry out a bit.
Yes. Okay. And he says like about a week. So enough so that it really does look dry, because if you drop it into the bag and it is soaking wet, it is probably going to rot. Yes. Which we do not want. So dried out plant, drop it in the bag, tie the top, forget about it until spring. 100% success rate, he says. With collocation.
What else has 100% success rate? Nothing that I can think of. Nothing.
And he's pretty, he's philosophical. He says, I tell all my plants when I bring them in, live if you want, die if you want. If you die, I'll get something prettier.
It's an opportunity to go shopping again.
He gives him a little pep talk.
Love it.
Who knows? Maybe that's his 100% success rate.
Maybe.
But this plastic bag tip works for colocasias, flowering maples, abutilon.
Oh, okay.
Oh, so good. We're saving, right? Lantanas and zonal geraniums, the ones that are only hardy zones 12 to 13. So any of those.
Interesting.
Same thing. Dig them up, dry them out, pop them in a bag, tie the top, forget about it.
That's quite a mix of plant material too. You've got the elephant ears that have like kind of tropical succulent type stems, a little bit of almost a bulbous nature to it sometimes. And then, all the way to abutilons that are like woody, shrubby, even lantana is woody and shrubby. So that's interesting.
Yeah, I was surprised to learn that all of these can be stored dormant. I really would have imagined something like a lantana that you would need to keep it growing and deal with the mealy bugs and all that situation.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. No, you can let them go dormant.
I love it. All right, so you have coffee cups on deck. Literally on deck this year, and you're going to give that a whirl. Are you growing it in ground or are you growing it in a pot?
No, this is honestly, this is not one that I'm growing this year.
Oh, okay.
So I have had colocasias in the past, but I just I let them go back to colocasia heaven at the end of the season. But I chose one that we had good photos of. It's a proven winners. And so that this is one that's going to be widely available and currently available. And I just love the color of it. So I chose it as an example because I wanted to talk about Irvin's technique.
No, I love it. I love it. I think that that's awesome. And yeah, that is a good colocasia. That's a beautiful one. It's really, really gorgeous. Worth looking at the picture of and then getting yourself excited to order for next year if anybody's listening. Okay, my last plant, much like you, I am growing it, but it's going to be an experiment because this is my first experience with this plant. So we talked about my agaves, and they're covered in spikes, and they can, cause blindness if you're not careful with its moving in and out. So for the first time ever, I decided to buy, and I have a few Mangavis this year. I think I had one last year that I entered into the mix, but this is, if you're not familiar with Mangavis, it is a cross between a Manfreda and an agave. And the claim to fame is that they're very low maintenance and low care like an agave, but like a Manfreda, they don't have spikes. They have these like large, luscious, succulent-y blades that are not going to put out an eye if you have to move it in and out of your house. And the other thing with Mangaves is, I will say, it's that Manfreda coloring that comes into the mix. They're crazy looking. Think of like a bright purple agave or a Mangave that has pink and yellow and white splashes and spots all over it. They're really, really interesting looking. And I resisted the urge because I'm like, oh my goodness, I can't start collecting something else. But mixing a few of them in with the agaves, most people think that they are agaves, and they're not. They're not. They're definitely different. So this year I got Snow Leopard, which is a cultivar, zones 8 to 11, full sun to partial shade, moist, well-drained soil, very similar conditions to the agave. And this one has very, very long, almost, I would say like foot-long blades, yucca-like blades to it. And it's a green leaf with a white stripe and then pink spatter painting on it. It's very, very interesting. And the more sun as opposed to partial shade that you put it in, you'll see more of that pink coloring come out onto the leaves. Really, really cool plant. And looked into it, and apparently, much like the agaves, it can basically live as a house plant in the winter, bring it in. However, I'm going to have to be a little more on my game because they're a little more frost sensitive than the agave. So whereas, I can go out there with a quilt and cover up the agaves, if I'm like not ready to move them all inside and we're going to get that random frost that comes a little bit earlier. I think with the Mangaves, I'm going to have to bring them in. They're just a titch more sensitive to cold weather. So those will be the first ones to come in. But Snow Leopard eventually is supposed to get up to 16 to 18 inches tall and 20 to 24 inches wide. So it's going to be a fairly decent size, more flat and wide than tall and spiky option, but that's going to be one that I'm going to give a whirl. My one thing is I'm a little concerned that they might need a bit more water. They tend, so far, the Mangaves outside have tended to want a little bit more water than the agaves do. So that gives me reason for pause of the overwintering with no water situation that I normally do. So stay tuned. It's tough love here at the Sherry household. So we're going to do tough love again and see if these Mangaves make it through.
Might need to put a saucer under it.
And now, because everything sounds better with a British accent, here's Peter to talk about how he gets ready for winter.
All this talk about bringing plants inside for the cooler days ahead has me a little depressed. It feels as though the second the July 4th weekend is in the rearview mirror, we start talking about leaves changing colour and debating the merits of pumpkin spice. I'm not ready for winter, but there are a few things I do to prepare myself for chillier temperatures. For one, I make sure my tea supply is fully stocked. Earl Grey preferably, although an occasional chamomile is great for a before-bedtime cuppa. One flavour you will never catch in the Chapman tea chest, pumpkin spice. Another preparatory action I take for cool weather is being sure we've got a decent supply of firewood ready for the fireplace. I know it's mainly for show and doesn't do much to actually heat our New England house, but the effect of a warm, glowing hearth is magical. And no, lighting a pumpkin spice candle is not the same. Not at all. The last thing I'll do to prepare myself for mainly indoor living is digging out my woolies from the back of the closet. There is no chill a thick fisherman's sweater cannot prevent. I have a few classic favourites, some dating back to my uni days. The fact that they still fit is a miracle indeed. And you know how I keep the moths from eating them to bits? Believe it or not, pumpkin spice air fresheners. I guess there is something that scent is good for after all.
So, Carol, I wasn't quite sure what we were going to get for Peter for Christmas, but because he gets so cold, I think that one of those slankets, remember those? It was like a blanket with arms or with sleeves. We should get him a slanket.
Yes, that surely represents our culture, and he will appreciate it.
I think he will. I definitely do. All right, let's see what the expert came up with for plants that they appreciate enough to overwinter.
Hi, my name is Chloe Bowers, and thank you for inviting me to contribute to Let's Argue About Plants today. I've worked as a gardener and a landscape designer for about 20 years now, with a focus on vegetables and native plants, and I live in Newtown, Connecticut, which is Zone 6B. Since my focus is usually vegetables, I picked 4 tender edible plants I personally like to overwinter, and I'm going to go through how I do that. The first plant I want to talk about is West Indian lemongrass, which is hardy in Zone 9 and up. And the reason I overwinter it is that I find the first year, the stalks really aren't big enough to be useful in cooking. And you might get a couple of chunkier stalks, but most of them are pretty spindly. So I started taking the plant inside and keeping it as a house plant, because when I would put it outside the next year, then I'd get lots of nice chunky stalks, and I could use them in my pseudo Thai cooking. So what I did the first year is I bought just a regular garden center. I bought a West Indian, that's important, lemongrass, as opposed to the East Indian, which does not make really usable stalks. So I bought a little starter plant and grew it for the summer. And at the end of the summer, I had it in about a 12-inch pot. And I took it out and took off the larger stalks that I could use. And there were maybe, just a handful of them. And repotted the rest of the plant, the smaller stalks. And I just brought it inside, before the frost. And I cut back any brown tips, cleaned it up, and I put it in a full sun window. And I just decided to treat it as a houseplant. And I was surprised to see how very well it did. I had read that you could overwinter them in a garage by cutting the whole thing back, and as long as it was frost-free, that it would come back the next year. But I tried that another year and had no success with that. But as a houseplant, it did really well, and it actually continued to grow most of the winter, albeit slowly. And as it went along, I would cut off any brown tips, but I kept it, reasonably well watered, and I do find that it likes quite a bit of water and a richer soil fertilizer. Once it was late May here in Newtown, I moved it back outside, hardened it off, and put it in a slightly larger pot. I potted it up. It was probably I probably put it in a 20-inch pot. It would be ideal. And I like to keep it in plastic because I find it doesn't like to dry out. You could also put it into the ground and dig it up every year. But to me, it's just easier, to keep it in a pot. And then, voila, big stalks. I was able to take big stalks off of my lemongrass that entire season. And then I just repeated the whole process over. And I've probably had that lemongrass about 5 years. And I did let it go. Recently I've moved, so I did let it go. This last year I have not repeated it, but I highly recommend overwintering your lemongrass, especially if you like East Asian cuisine. Another plant I always overwinter is my rosemary shrub. And rosemary is, of course, purported to be hardy to Zone 6, which is my zone. But I find that when I plant it in the ground and leave it, I don't know if it's the damp or the cold. I suspect it's probably the New England damp. It kills it every year. So instead I have my rosemary in a clay pot and I move it in and out Actually, I move it in and out all year because what I find works best for it and keeps it happiest is exposing it to a degree of cold. So I try to emulate a Mediterranean winter, essentially. My rule of thumb is if it's above 28 degrees, I keep the rosemary outside. And I have it next to a sliding door, a sunny sliding door, and I just pop it out the door on the warmer days and nights, and then bring it in if the temperature is supposed to go under 28. So in this way, it doesn't dry out as much in my indoor heat, and there's some humidity that the plant needs and some chill that the plant needs to be successful. And it's a bit of a pain to move it in and out, but worthwhile to me because the reason I even started overwintering it is I want rosemary available to me all year. And especially in the winter when you're making roasts and turkeys and things that you want rosemary for. And I also have a bay tree and a sweet myrtle, and I treat them in the exact same way. So everyone goes out if it's above 28, and everyone comes back in when it's, usually January, February. They don't spend a whole lot of time outside. But even then, we get a few rainy, warm days, and I'll pop them outside. And they all seem to really appreciate that, and they really flourish. Perhaps the plant I've been most excited about overwintering is Malabar Spinach, which is a vine, about a 10-foot vine, with edible leaves and kind of pretty flowers, and it's usually treated as an annual in my zone. But one year I grew it in a container, and it went to seed at the end of the season, and it dropped some seeds into a pot that was sitting next to it. That pot was a houseplant, and it came back inside in the fall. And then a month or so later, I noticed that there were Malabar spinach seedlings coming up in the pot. And since I'm always loath to pull out any useful seedling, I decided to let them go. And I had it in a very sunny window. And it just took off. It started to even climb the curtains next to it, and it climbed all over the houseplants around it. And it was perfectly usable. And I like Malabar spinach. I'll cook with it. I like it raw. I think it's delicious. I actually like it even a little bit better than regular spinach. So I was really pleased to know that I could keep it over winter inside. So I used it at will over the winter and grew slowly. I mean, not as fast as it would outside. And the leaves actually got quite large in their quest for light. But in this case, that was pretty useful because then I had large leaves to use in my food. In June, after the weather was reliably warm, I moved the whole thing outside again, and I cut it back. In order to move it, I had to cut the vines back. And then the mother plant continued to grow, but it dropped more seed into the pot, and those germinated, and those took off for the summer season. And then I was able to repeat the whole thing again. Come fall, I brought it in, and seedlings just kept coming up in the pot. I let them grow inside, took it out again, and on and on and on. And now I'm very pleased to have added year-round spinach to my food stash. The last plant I like to overwinter is Mexican sour gherkin, or cucamelon, or mouse melon, as my kids always like to call it. It is a small vine, maybe about 6 feet, and it has little tiny leaves and little tiny flowers and these little tiny, tangy, delicious, lemony fruits that often make an appearance in my kids' lunches because they enjoy them so much. I like to grow it in a pot with, like a tomato cage or any small trellis I have around. Because in my garden it tends to get overwhelmed or I forget about it because it's such a sweet little petite thing. So every year I just put it on my deck in full sun in a good potting soil, and I feed it pretty frequently. At the end of one year, I was dumping out the soil after frost, and the vine had pretty much died back. And I discovered that there were these tubers in the pot, these crispy white tubers. And I thought perhaps I could save these like you would a dahlia or other root and replant them in the spring and see what happens. So I put them in a smaller pot and some fresh potting soil in the garage, and I just moistened it a little bit and kept it up on a shelf. my garage stays frost free. That seems to be important. You don't want it to freeze since it's a tropical vine. But perhaps a fridge would work as long as it doesn't freeze. In the spring, when my garage started to warm up, I remembered my little tuber and I brought it inside and put it in another pot, a bigger pot, and it sprouted. It started to grow. So once we got past our last frost, which in Newtown is late May, I put it outside as I normally would my seedlings, and it grew much better than the seedling plants ever did. And I got earlier mouse melons, and it was a success. So that's one that I definitely recommend if you like the fruit, which we love it. I definitely recommend overwintering.
I always love hearing how people justify which plants they're willing to overwinter versus not willing to overwinter. And I feel like I'm very harsh in my dividing line of what I'm willing to overwinter. You're a little better, and so is our expert, was a little more willing to give plants the benefit of the doubt and do a little more extra effort.
Yes, it's not tough love everywhere, right? The heart wants what the heart wants, and we all want different things.
I love it.